The red earth stretched out like a coarse carpet, scorched in a place where someone had tried to burn away a secret. In the drone's camera feed, a rectangle of twisted metal glinted between blackened branches, as if the forest had swallowed a scream and returned only silence. 11 years earlier, a man in a straw hat and a woman in a blue dress had closed their porch door saying they would be back for lunch. They never were. What burned in that place wasn't just gasoline. It was time. It was money. It was two lives the town had learned to call by their first names. The morning of June 24th, 1992 began like any other on the Rocha farm in São Miguel do Araguaia. The rooster crowed early, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen with its worn tiles, and the zinc roof dripped with the remnants of the dawn drizzle. José Humberto, 61, rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt and checked the corral. Calves nursing, fences tight, salt in the trough. Almerinda, 57, pinned up her hair and sorted papers in her leather handbag. Harvest notes, a contract for the sale of cattle, the small concrete promise of a more comfortable future. The deal, discussed for months, was finally ready to be settled, a number they could hardly believe they were saying out loud. 5 million reais. A mountain of money for those who had learned to save every penny and see profit in the rain falling at just the right time. Jose leaned against the blue D20 pickup, listening as the engine turned over with a familiar rumble that had been their companion for a decade. He patted its side, the way a man thanks a good horse. On the porch, a young farmhand named Tiao asked if he should pack them a lunch. Jose said no, that it was just a matter of paperwork and banks, that they'd be back before the sun doubled its heat over the pasture. Almerinda adjusted her bag's strap, took 2 steps back to turn off the living room light, and said goodbye to the dog, who lay down beside the doorframe. The scene remained etched in everyone's memory. The dust kicking up as they left, the truck's shadow stretching down the dirt road, the sound of the engine fading to a hum, then to nothing. The town in this northern stretch of Goiás was a simple place of wide streets, single-story houses, and shops that closed in the sweltering afternoon heat. Their plan was to sign the papers, check the payment installments, arrange the transfer to an investment account, and stop by the stationer's to buy notebooks for the cook's son. It seemed like a simple day, but somewhere between the farm gate and the paved road, their routine was severed by a fold in time that no one could ever pinpoint. Tião waited until late afternoon with the kind of restlessness only those who work with animals understand. The feeling that something in the air is out of place. Every hour he would look down the road, hands on his hips, seeing only old dust and wind. As night fell, he turned on the porch light. At 9, he called one of the couple's sons in Goiânia, his voice apologizing for the intrusion. "They must have stayed in town," the son said, trying to give his own fear a steady voice. At midnight, the kitchen still held a covered pot of beans, the rice was ready, and 2 plates were set at the table out of habit. The clock read 12:27 when the phone rang back. "We're leaving now." The sons arrived as dawn bled into the sky, their headlights cutting through the darkness of the dirt road. The house was tidy. No ransacked drawers, no broken doors. The radio was still whispering softly, a country music program that kept Almerinda company in the mornings. The dog recognized their footsteps but paced the porch, as if expecting someone else. The absence had the weight of furniture. It was as if every object was a reminder of the path that should have been. Jose's mug in the dish rack, the notebook with accounts for salt and feed, the spare key to the D20 hanging on a nail behind the door. At daybreak, the first impulse was spontaneous. They woke the neighbors, saddled horses, and spread the word. The region stirred like a disturbed anthill. Everyone knew the Rochas and the packed dirt road that led to town. They searched along creek beds at the edge of the sparse woods on cattle trails and in marshlands where the mud clung to their ankles. Anyone who had driven the highway said they saw nothing. The bank manager confirmed they had never arrived. The eldest son sat on the steps watching the horizon dry under the sun, feeling that fear that lives in the pit of your stomach and grows in silence. Day turned to night, and no one could invent an explanation that fit on the kitchen table. It was then that the first theories began to collide. A robbery, a kidnapping gone wrong, an old feud no one could quite remember. But the Rochas had no known enemies. They didn't get into trouble. They lived by the rhythm of cattle, markets, and Sunday Mass. The only concrete fact was a large contract about to become real money. And money, no matter how you try to hide it, always sparks greed in someone. In those first 24 hours, the wind sweeping across the dirt road felt like a harsh message. Either someone had blocked the path, or the path itself had swallowed the truck. There were no skid marks, no piece of a bumper. There was only the raw certainty that families in the countryside know all too well. When night falls and someone doesn't come home, something serious has happened. Silence slept in the living room, heavy and thick, while outside the moon passed between thin clouds and the dry grass rustled like paper. Before the sun could warm the porch wood, the sons divided the tasks. One went to the city to retrace the route, asking at workshops, gas stations, and roadside stalls. The other stayed at the farm, coordinating the farmhands and neighbors, writing down every rumor, every "I think I saw something" in a notebook. Trying not to get lost in the whirlwind of voices. The next morning brought dust in their teeth and not a single clue. No one had heard a crash. No one remembered a tow truck in the area. No mechanic had seen a D20 with a recent scratch. The bank manager repeated what he had already said. No signature, no withdrawal. At the notary's office, they confirmed the appointment. The couple had been scheduled for that Tuesday, but they never showed up. In the absence of a path forward, the body creates routine to keep from collapsing. They prepared lunch, but the food stuck in their throats. The radio was left on loud, as if information might leap from the airwaves. In the afternoon, they decided to drive a little used side road, a gravel track that truckers took to avoid potholes in the dry season. The family's spare D20 vibrated on the loose stones, and the wind cut through the open window like a hot blade. They stopped in the shade of every tree at every dip in the road. The smell of old brush fires hung in the air, confusing the senses. They found an old cigarette butt and a tire track that could have belonged to any vehicle. Frustration came in waves. In the days that followed, São Miguel do Araguaia became a map of speculation. Someone claimed to have seen a blue pickup heading toward Porangatu. Others spoke of two men stopped in the middle of the road, asking for help. Still others swore the couple had stopped at a tire shop and then driven on. The problem with these accounts was the gap between the confidence in the telling and the precision of the details. No one remembered license plates, times, or faces. It was 1992. Memory depended on the eye and the heart. There were no cameras, no trackers, no cell phone towers. The town had payphones and patience. At night, the main house filled with extra mattresses, coffee brewing at all hours, and a silence punctuated by quiet prayers. Almerinda had a ledger with columns for income and expenses, the prices of corn sacks and oil, accounts that were never wrong. That ledger remained on the table, open to the week of the disappearance, with a scribbled reminder: sign contract, check amount. The sons held the page as if trying to warm a cold object. The money, frozen by legal advice until the absence was resolved, transformed from a promise into a wall. What was meant to bring relief became a heavy subject, entering conversations with the grace of a falling stone. In the community, the cruelest comment was the one wrapped in rationality. "When there's big money, there's someone who wants it," a shopkeeper said. But who? The cattle buyer, a man of his word, appeared at the farm, his face drawn. He sat on the porch for hours, documents in hand. He said he would pay what was agreed upon as soon as there was someone to receive it, that he wanted no profit from a tragedy. The gesture was seen as honest, but it offered no clues. All they had were names, commitments, and the couple's photograph on the mantelpiece, their gazes fixed on anyone who passed through the living room. On the second weekend, regional firefighters flew over sections of the area in a borrowed helicopter, searching for signs of a recent board, a stuck vehicle, the glint of metal. From above, the landscape was a repeating pattern of low plateaus, palm-fringed streams, and red corridors of earth. Where the wind drew waves in the dust, nothing shone back like an answer. On the ground, the farmhands continued on foot, the mud pulling at the soles of their boots, sniffing for the trail of tires. With every hilltop they climbed, hope would rise, only to fall again with the view. One night, the youngest son, exhausted, lay down on a porch bench and woke to the sound of rain on the zinc roof. Water ran down the gutter and dripped into a bucket with the steady rhythm of a clock. Time was passing, just like that, drop by drop. He was a grown man, but in the dark his mother was just a memory, a drawing in the shadows. No one said it out loud, but the fear of having lost them both forever had already taken root. Still, everyone kept moving because moving was the only way to cheat their own helplessness. If you have followed the story this far and want to know what happened next, subscribe to the channel now. That way you won't miss the upcoming chapters and you'll help this investigative work reach more people. The dry winter set in, and dust settled in closets, in the folds of skirts, between the pages of books. The farm carried on without its owners, and each day without news seemed to cement their disappearance. Jose's dog stopped barking at passing trucks. The town, as towns do, began to get used to it, and that hurt more than anything. Under the couple's bed, a pair of his boots was found with mud still clinging to the soles, mud that time had hardened into a relic. And the photograph, the one in the living room, began to be regarded with a sad respect, like a saint on a wall. What followed was an investigation defined by persistence and the limits of the era. The police station filed the reports, but their tools were few. Letterhead paper, a typewriter, a phone line that often dropped. The sons learned to answer the same questions over and over, always striving for precision so the story wouldn't twist itself into knots. Jose left the house at such and such a time. He was wearing a white shirt, jeans, a wide-brimmed straw hat. His wallet held his documents, and the D20 had a small dent on the left bumper. Almerinda carried her leather bag with a sheaf of papers and perhaps a small calculator. The shortest route was the one they always took. The road had two curves with soft sand, where a car could drift if the driver was distracted. None of this led to a single objective clue. Rumors were given names. There was talk of an old land dispute in the neighboring municipality, supposedly reignited after a poorly made deal in the 80s. There was talk of business jealousy, of a competitor who couldn't stand the Roches' success at keeping their accounts in order and their gates full of cattle. There was talk of a planned robbery, of outsiders who had been seen sizing up the house. Each hypothesis was a horse to be saddled and ridden, only to return with a dirty saddle and empty hands. The family responded with caution, never accusing, never spreading gossip. Their greatest fear was turning desperation into injustice. Meanwhile, the farm began to show the impact of their absence. Overgrown grass needed cutting. The corral fence needed new planks. The water pump made a strange noise. Without Jose's hand to fix things and Almerinda's eye to organize, everything felt slightly off kilter. The sons, torn between their jobs in the capital and their vigil in the countryside, took turns staying for weeks at a time. The documents the accountant requested became a stack of photocopies that smelled of a hot machine. The money from the contract, now a legal matter, was stuck in a cold limbo. The news spread across the state, printed in newspapers that yellowed quickly. A year passed, then 2, then 5. On each of their wedding anniversaries, the family would gather around a large table and someone would tell a story about the time Jose fixed a tractor with a piece of wire, or when Almerinda predicted a market's outcome in her notebook just by listening to the sound of the rain. São Miguel do Araguaia absorbed the case like a scar. The younger generation grew up hearing the phrase, "the couple who disappeared with the blue D20," as if it were a legend, but one without fantasy, only a quiet knot in the throat. Next to the church, a bulletin board held faded posters, renewed pleas for hope. Time, that master of disguise, seemed to follow a different calendar when it came to providing answers. Then, in 2003, an environmental project began flying drones over stretches of the Cerrado to map illegal burns in areas of regeneration. The drone was a novelty then, a piece of equipment cobbled together from adaptations, light and noisy, controlled by technicians who carried small notebooks to jot down coordinates. The Cerrado, seen from above, possessed a sad beauty. The rectangles of pasture looked like a game board. The footpaths were threads shimmering like water snakes, and the gnarled trees cast long, finger-like shadows on the red earth. The camera documented the scars, black patches where fire had swept through, the faint tracks of tires, clearings hastily cut by loggers. It was on one of these flights, near midday, when the heat makes the horizon shimmer, that a technician noticed something that broke the pattern of the shadows. There was a dull metallic glint, half buried in dust, in an area where dry branches crisscrossed like a trap. He asked his colleague to keep the drone low and slow, to prevent the wind from the propellers from kicking up more dirt than the lens could handle. The rectangle sharpened into focus, first the scorched edges, then the outline of a cabin. Finally, a dark void where a roof should have been. A heavy silence spread through the makeshift base camp. The screen showed what looked like the carcass of a vehicle. The hood was stained with old soot, and its side wore a shade of rust that had long made peace with time. The passenger door was ajar, as if it had been opened into a single permanent angle. Inside, the camera captured pale shapes, the stark white of bones arranged on a front seat. The raw image cut through the technicians like a knife. They weren't crime scene investigators. They were men of the countryside, accustomed to measuring the scars left by fire. In that instant, they understood they had stumbled upon a story that was not theirs to own, but one that was crying out for help. The news traveled through the proper channels quietly. Coordinates were noted, landmark trees were marked. Care was taken to ensure that the curious wouldn't arrive first. The team landed the drone with trembling hands and looked up at the afternoon sky, which was beginning to lose its color. The wind made the dust dance in small whirlwinds. One of the technicians, born in Goiás, thought of the stories his mother used to tell, of the names the countryside learns to repeat for years. And for the first time in a long while, someone dared to imagine that the disappearance of the Rochas might have an answer hidden here in a fold of land that time had tried to swallow. While the official arrival was being arranged, the wilderness kept its secret in silence. The smell of burning was now just a memory, but the earth, when disturbed, has a way of giving up its stories. And there, where twisted branches pointed in every direction, a metal skeleton seemed to breathe with the heat, waiting for hands that understood the patience of the Cerrado. The coming hours would decide if that glint of light was a matter of chance or of destiny. In São Miguel do Araguaia, still knowing nothing, someone in the living room of a quiet house ran a hand over a photograph. blowing away the dust as if sensing a change in the sound of the wind at the door. The environmental team took the location to those who needed to hear it, and early the next day, when the sun still left the ground cool, official cars and two small trucks carved a path down the dirt road. The roar of an engine startled a ground dove, sending dust up in a low cloud. The cerrado, which in the morning smells of crushed grass and cool shade, seemed to hold its breath. The scene confirmed what the camera had shown from a distance. It was a large, old pickup truck, its roof gone, reduced to a cage of twisted iron. The hood was blistered, the paint peeled back by the heat. The truck bed, covered in old soot, had spots where rust had eaten through to the bone. The passenger door remained open, locked in place by a hinge that no longer obeyed. Inside, on the front seats, two skeletons held a kind of ghastly domestic posture. One was turned forward, the seatbelt still crossing its pelvic bones. The other was reclined, its head tilted to the side like someone who had drifted off mid-conversation. All around, the vegetation told a story in silence. Blackened branches marked the place of an old fire, the kind that burns fast and leaves charcoal fingers pointing at the sky. The red earth, hardened by years of alternating drought and rain, showed faint grooves, ancient tire tracks that no longer said anything. There were no recent footprints, no fuel cans, no loose objects that might have escaped the blaze. The cerrado had done its work, eating away at the edges, leaving the scene almost clean. As technicians marked the perimeter with tape and stakes, someone noticed a detail that at first seemed trivial. The key was in the ignition, turned. The melted dashboard still held the shadow of the speedometer. Later they would say that the gear shift was still pointed forward, fused by the heat, indicating the truck might have been in gear when the fire took hold. On the floor beneath the seat, a small oval piece of metal caught the light. It was the warped, tarnished body of a wedding band, its surface pitted by the heat. One of Almerinda's daughters would later recall that her mother wore the ring a little loose, that it would spin on her finger when she washed dishes. The vehicle's identification came from a sequence of numbers etched into a part of the chassis that had escaped the worst of the destruction. Anyone who knew the old D20s knew where to look. The letters and numbers, their edges eaten away, were read with the patience of someone deciphering a water-damaged note. It confirmed what their hearts already knew. This was José and Almerinda's truck. The weight of that fact turned the silence into a shroud of shallow breaths. In São Miguel do Araguaia, the news traveled faster than the August wind. The children received the phone call from a voice that measured each word, trying not to sever the thread of hope that had held for 11 years. They drove that same day, stopping only for gas, their minds racing. When they arrived, the scene had been preserved like a somber altar. They couldn't touch, only look. What they saw could never be unseen. The ring of skeletal trees, the contrast of the red earth against the gray metal, the white glint of bone. The eldest son took a deep breath and, against his will, recognized the dent on the bumper his father used to slap with his palm every time he washed the truck. Memory hurts most where it touches reality. The youngest daughter saw the brown handle of the open door and remembered her mother telling her to hold on tight around the sandy curves. The recovery work was slow under a sun that beat down like a hammer. With every piece that was moved, dust rose and clung to their skin like flour. The bones were collected with respect, placed in simple boxes, because it is the care, not the elaborate word, that gives dignity to the gesture. The truck was hoisted by a small winch and slowly dragged to the road, leaving a dark signature scraped into the earth. High above, a caracara circled, curious, before landing on a dry branch the fire had spared. In town, the wake was held without a visible body, a decision born of both modesty and memory. The wreaths of flowers gave off a sweet perfume that was almost sickening in the heat. People embraced as if apologizing for something. The priest spoke little. The most powerful words came from those who had not prepared but had simply lived alongside them. A neighbor who remembered borrowing a hoe. A godmother who told of the afternoon Almerinda taught her how to shred chicken without wasting a single fiber. The sound of chairs scraping across the parish hall floor, the juice served in plastic cups. The crying that was at once contained and raw. It all painted a portrait of farewell that the countryside knows all too well. Days later, the less dramatic but equally painful stage began. The search for possible answers within the limits of what time allows. Photographs of bones were compared with old X-rays from a small-town clinic. Metal and soot were analyzed to understand if the fire had been fed by something other than gasoline and time. The most painful question was cruelly simple. Why were they still in their seats? There was no sign they had tried to escape. The seatbelt across the driver's hip was both a clue and a nightmare. The most discussed theory, spoken in low voices, was that someone had forced them there, held them immobile, and set the fire. Another possibility, floated by those who knew mechanics, spoke of an electrical fire starting in the engine and engulfing the cab by surprise. But the position of the bodies suggested control, not a frantic escape. The location of the discovery said a great deal without saying everything. It wasn't on the direct route to town, but it wasn't impossibly far either. A detour down a side road, 2 or 3 cattle crossings, an entrance known only to those who used it often. The kind of clearing you pull into when you don't want to be seen. Whoever drove the D20 there knew the land, knew the landscape, and was perhaps counting on the regrowth of the wild to cover their tracks. The fire, more than just erasing, was meant to confuse, and for many years it had worked. The children returned to the farm feeling as though they had closed one door only to open a much larger one. They slept little, listening to the wind against the eaves and the persistent rustle of peaky leaves on the dry ground. The old dog, who no longer barked at anything, lay with his head on the youngest son's boot, as if guarding someone. The next morning, the smell of coffee seemed stronger. Every corner of the house spoke their names, and absence took the shape of what had once been routine. The clank of the water tank lid, Almerinda's laugh when she found loose change in her apron pocket, Jose's clearing of his throat just before he spoke. From that point on, reopening the story meant facing questions that had been avoided out of respect for the pain. Who knew about the land contract besides those directly involved? At what point did that information become common gossip? Where had trust given way to risk? The money, which had never been tangible, returned to the scene as a possible motive. 5 million does not simply vanish from the imagination, even when frozen by a judge. The road with its clinging dust held the memory of that day, but offered nothing more than a silent film. And the town, an unwitting witness, prepared to hear once more the names and routes that had been repeated for years, now illuminated by the glare of a burnt-out truck in the middle of the wilderness. The following days brought people together around long tables with papers spread out and glasses of water sweating in the heat. What was known for certain filled half a page. The couple left home that June morning. They never made it to the bank. The D20 was burned in a clearing. 2 skeletons were in the front seats. The rest was a path to be picked apart with patience, like shucking a good ear of corn. The children brought out the old notebooks where they had recorded rumors from the 90s. Names of farms, nicknames of people who passed through the gates, clues that had seemed too cold at the time but now took on a new light. The world had changed since then, but the truth, if it existed, still resided in the same places. In memory, in the small stubbornness of matter, in the lines that logic draws across a map. People were asked to remember. The tire repairman by the side of the road recalled that, on the day before the disappearance, 2 men had stopped, asking about freight services. They had no cargo, just questions. The clerk at the gas station thought he'd seen a blue D20 filling up early that week. But in that region, he said, a blue D20 is practically a surname, and he couldn't say if it had the Roach's customary dent. A traveling knife salesman remembered being asked for a good shortcut to avoid the highway patrol, a question that sounded normal enough from drivers in a hurry. The memories, both vivid and flawed, formed a broken mosaic. At home, the contract paperwork was laid out on the table, a napkin placed under a glass to keep from wetting the pages. There was the buyer's name, proof of intent to pay, deadlines, figures. Nothing in it suggested a trap. The buyer, an old-fashioned man of his word, repeated his offer to honor the deal as soon as the courts allowed. The timeline was recited aloud countless times until the hours felt like bricks being put back into a wall. What was missing was the scene that explained the turn, the exact moment someone chose to divert the course of two lives. The conversations reached the neighboring fences. Old men sitting on benches in the shade remembered a group of cattle buyers who had been active in the 90s, men who always knew the price of silence. Others spoke of possible old debts, debts that weren't theirs but could have splashed onto them by association. But the Roach's reputation, even under a magnifying glass, remained clean. They were discreet, paid on time, and treated their employees well. What existed, as in any place where big money passes through, was a chain of petty envies and conveniences. The analysis of what remained of the truck provided some practical elements. Parts of the front seat indicated that the fabric had been consumed rapidly, as happens when an accelerant soaks into the interior. This pointed to a fire that either started from the inside out or was fed by liquid poured onto the seats. The floor, however, was not melted in the way it would be if the fire had come from underneath. The most likely conclusion was arson. There was not enough scattered glass to suggest a major impact. The windshield had likely been consumed by the heat. Personal effects were missing, and in the truck of country folk, this was stranger still. Almerinda always carried a cloth bag with headache medicine, a needle and thread, and loose change. None of it was found. The seatbelt, still draped across the skeleton on the left, became a key piece of the puzzle. Among acquaintances, Jose was a methodical man, but he always said the seatbelt felt too tight. When working the fields, he would often forget to wear it on the dirt roads. He did, however, put it on whenever he hit the asphalt. But the clearing asked for no seatbelt. If he was buckled in, someone must have insisted. The passenger's position reclined, aligned with a terrible image of someone placed that way so the flames could rise without resistance. There were marks of intense heat around the fuel tank, yet the cap was intact. It was as if the rush to erase history had triumphed over caution. And the cerrado, that great ally of secrets, did the rest. In parallel, life, in all its dimensions, went on. On the farm, the smell of manure still greeted the dawn, and the guava trees out back insisted on bearing fruit. For the first time, the sons entered their parents' bedroom without the feeling they were invading. They opened the wardrobe and touched Jose's shirts, the creases still sharp from Almerinda's ironing board. In the back of a drawer, they found a small, broken statue of a saint, mended with tape, and an old, yellowed photograph. The two of them, young. He, without his hat. She, laughing, in a river of clear water. Nothing in their entire life seemed to point toward an escape, a pact, or some dark bargain. What there was a marriage of decades and a simple plan, as sturdy as a well-made fence. In town, the case was in the papers again. This time, with no promise of a quick resolution, but with the raw power of an aerial image. The capital's television station picked up the story, and the clearing became a map on the evening news. People who had never set foot on Red Earth offered their opinions on the tragedy, maps, intentions, but those who lived there, accustomed to the cadence of the wind and the sound of rain on a zinc roof, preferred to hold their judgment and repeat what they knew. A road knows footsteps, and a farm's secret is never born of nothing. It is planted. The problem is discovering by whom and in which soil. Between paperwork and silences, a provisional consensus took shape, one that could fit inside everyone's head without breaking. On that June 24th, someone knew about the appointment at the bank. They intercepted the couple's route via a known detour. They drove the D20 to the clearing, kept the couple inside the truck, and for reasons still obscure, set it all on fire. Whether for money, an old threat, or opportunistic greed, no single piece of evidence offered a firm answer. All that remained was one certainty: the fire had not started on its own in that land. And the memory of the drone slicing through the sky 11 years later seemed almost ironic. As if the cerrado had allowed technology to find what the human eye had grown tired of searching for in the open. The symbolic burial, with the bones divided between two discrete urns, took place on an afternoon when the hot wind made the little flags of the town square's June festival flutter like applause. The church smelled of wax and flowers. On the way out, an old woman touched the daughter's arm and said that in the end, the earth always asks for truth, even when it only gives back pieces. That day, the Roches became people again, no longer a pure mystery. And yet the larger question, as stubborn as bitter grass, continued to grow between the stones. With the dust settled and the wreaths of flowers already wilting, the family had to face what usually comes later: organizing the inheritance of an interrupted life. The judge kept Roche's assets frozen until the formal conclusion of the process. Converting absence into death, a legal path that moves slowly like a fattened ox climbing a hill. The weary sons alternated between meetings in town and trips to the notary's office, all while trying not to let the farm slide down the slope of neglect. The corral got a new plank, the zinc roof was patched with tar, and the water pump, which had been coughing for years, finally gave out during the hottest week of the year. It was as if things were demanding extra care, a constant reminder that a house without its master needs a watchful eye and a steady hand. In the bedroom, Almerinda's leather handbag, kept since 1992, was opened with a delicacy that felt like a ceremony. Inside there was a handkerchief, a slip of paper, a crooked little note with a few numbers added up, and in the smaller pocket, the cap from a medicine bottle. The bundle of contract papers was not there, for that had been the reason for the journey. The act of searching the bag was not to find a treasure, but to hear the old sound of the leather and bring back a presence. On the dresser, her account book was now consulted in search of a pattern. Almost as if method could teach them how to endure, Almerinda's firm handwriting had the power to hold the world steady on the page. The sons visited the clearing one last time before the vegetation covered the ground with new leaves once more. They brought water and hats because the August sun cuts the back of your neck. They parked the truck a few meters away and got out slowly, as if stepping into a church. The place, without the carcass of the D20, seemed less violent, but it remained a circle of absence. On the trunk of one tree, the heat had left its mark, a stretch of black like a shadow where nothing grows. Here, the silence had texture. The wind passed through, carrying the smell of hot earth and something that recalled rust. One of the sons, who had never believed in promises made to the air, spoke softly, not to ask for anything, but to affirm that he would take care of the farm, that he would keep the name clean, that their story would not end in this hole. Back in town, certain questions began to take concrete shape. There was a stretch of road where, in 1992, a narrow wooden bridge forced every vehicle to slow down. It was a point of opportunity for anyone wanting to pull a truck alongside and start a conversation. Near the bridge lived a caretaker who remembered hearing, on that day, An engine stopped for longer than usual. He didn't see a license plate, but he retained the impression of two male voices, calm in tone and then silence. It was little, and time had cast a shadow over the details, but the mental map began to align. From there to the clearing was an unmarked dirt track, but one well worn by locals. The conversation about the money was handled carefully among themselves. There was no proof that the sum was the direct motive, but its size was imposing. The contract was not an absolute secret. In a small town, documents generate whispers that pass from mouth to mouth, twisting a little with each telling. Whether someone had overheard at the bank counter, in the notary's hallway, or in a neighbor's pasture, could no longer be known. What was known was that the amount, for that time, was life-changing. Anyone who grew up near the countryside knows the glint in the eye of someone who sees an opportunity, and also knows its shadow. One afternoon, the man who had bought the cattle returned to the farm. He sat on the veranda, asked for a glass of water, and waited. Under his arm, he carried a folder with papers and certified copies. He said he would honor the agreement, that he didn't want that story to end as a frozen number. He even offered to help manage the herd during that period. The gesture was received not with suspicion, but with the prudence of someone who has suddenly lost their measure of the world. There, two men shook hands firmly and stood for a while, looking out at the open pasture, listening to the soft chatter of a parakeet. It was a moment of humanity in a case that threatened to become nothing more than an enigma. The formal process of identifying the remains followed its bureaucratic path, pulling paperwork from drawers where it had been scattered for decades. In the end, the documents said what their hearts already screamed. It was them. With that, the legal deadlines began to run, allowing the family to access the accounts, resolve pending issues, to breathe without the discomfort of feeling like tenants in their own history. It wasn't comfort, merely the possibility of moving forward. Grief, when it finds its form, also organizes courage. The community reacted as it always does when an old wound is stirred, with care in their greetings, with a cake delivered in a cloth-wrapped bundle, with a quiet "call if you need anything" spoken at the gate. The case, which had become a myth, took on the contours of a news report and then settled into its humblest vocation: conversation on a park bench. Voices still emerged, claiming to have seen this or that, but with each passing day, the need to find a monster where there was only an old trail diminished. The sons learned a kind of hard wisdom. Sometimes the most justice the world can offer is to call things by their name and continue to care for what was left behind. At the end of 2003, when the first heavy rains fell and the smell of wet earth rose from the ground like a warm blanket, the farm came back to life. The water beating on the zinc roof made music. The mud stuck to the soles of their boots and widened their street. They planted new grass and fixed a fence that gave way every evening. They washed out the corral as one might sweep a room after a difficult visit. In every gesture there was a farewell and a promise. The names José and Almerinda ceased to be just a topic of conversation, and once again became the presence of those who teach without being there. On an ordinary night, the eldest son went out to the veranda, sat on the steps, and saw the house lights on, glowing without excess. The open, cloudless sky was rehearsing its stars. He thought of the drone that had cut through the air and revealed what no one could see of the clearing, which had returned silence in the form of metal, and of the 11 years of waiting that now seemed like a single block of time, hard and opaque. And he decided without an oath that his parents' story would not be a message of fear but a memory of steadfastness. It was little against the world, but it was what he could hold in two hands. The case, now free from the shock of the initial announcement, entered the phase of questions that seem small but can sometimes push open a heavy door. The family decided to retrace with unnerving calm every curve of the 1992 route. They left before the sun beat down, passed through the gate that groaned just as it had before, across the shallow creek where the herons used to land, and arrived at the old wooden bridge. Now reinforced, back then it had forced any driver to slow down and listen to the song of the floorboards. They stopped the truck, turned off the engine, and let the silence summon memory. The local caretaker, the same one who held the impression of voices, appeared with a worn hat and slow steps. He said that on that St. John's Day, the sound of a stopped engine had lingered longer than usual. He didn't remember faces, but he remembered the pause, the memory of a man who lives by watching water rise and fall. From the bridge to the clearing, they followed a dirt track lost on any map. Not a GPS shortcut or a straight line, but a seam stitched by those who pass every week. The cerrado opens its body to those who understand it and closes to those who try to rush. The family's truck moved slowly, the steering wheel held firm, hands sweating a little in the accumulated heat. When they reached the coordinates, the recovered vegetation moved with the wind like a sea of leaves. There was no more metal. Only the dark mark on the tree trunk, an edge of charcoal, like the fingernail of a child who comes back dirty after playing in the yard. There for a few minutes no one spoke a word. The air tasted of old dust, and the loudest sound was the rustling of dry husks on the ground. When the conversation returned, it was direct, without fantasy. For someone to have led them both here, they needed to know the road and the routine. The bridge would have served as a natural break. The driver pulls over, talks, receives a request for help, a supposedly faster route to avoid a patrol car or a pothole. José, a man of good faith, would not have refused help from someone who spoke gently and with respect. Almerinda, accustomed to resolving things calmly, would not have made a scene over an insistent request. The hypothesis of control without explicit violence, of firm persuasion, took shape in the details of the landscape. The violence would have come later, when the clearing offered enough shadow for the next act. Returning to town, the sons decided to listen to those who, 11 years earlier, had worked in freight and cattle trading in the region. A retired truck driver who knew every fuel stop and every bar counter, remembered a duo from the 90s who offered road security in exchange for favors. They weren't men with pistols showing at their waists. They were all talk, a smile at the corner of the mouth, promises of safekeeping. The truck driver hadn't seen them since before 2000. The testimony, though it didn't provide a full name, illuminated a certain logic, that crime, when it wants to appear as routine, dresses itself as help. And if the motive was money, it operated like a shadow, stretching itself until the opportunity arose. Tiao, the farmhand who saw the D20 leave that morning, had carried a silent weight ever since the disappearance. One August night, with a moonless sky and the distant call of a nightjar, he asked for permission to speak. He said that on the eve of the trip, while waiting for bread at the store, he had mentioned casually that his bosses were going to the bank early. He didn't mention an amount, gave no details. He spoke the way one comments on the weather. At the counter, there had been a man in a hat, not from the area, one of those types who watches everything and says little. Tiao didn't want to turn guilt into an explanation, but he offered his memory like someone handing over an object found on the ground. The family listened with serenity, not looking for a culprit where there was only human carelessness. The comment fit within the map of events, not as a single piece, but as a thread someone might have pulled. The technicians who had analyzed the truck in 2003 returned to the farm, their reports now cold on the page. They explained in simple terms what the evidence told them. The distribution of the heat marks suggested a fire fed by a liquid accelerant from inside the cabin. The densest soot stains traced a diagonal line, starting from the passenger side floor and climbing toward a ceiling that was no longer there. The remains of the seatbelt held the shrunken, contorted pattern of plastic burned at high temperature. There had been no fuel tank explosion, no sign of a violent impact. There had only been a fire, fast, efficient, likely set by someone who wanted neither noise nor the appearance of an accident. Time, an ally to secrecy, had erased most of the finer traces, but it left behind this skeleton of logic. The question of why remained an old feud, unlikely given the couple's quiet life. A deal gone wrong? The market said no. The contract, however, held a shine that could blind the prudent. $5 million in the early 1990s was enough to change the very scale of a person's dreams. Perhaps the initial plan was to abduct them, force a withdrawal. But the lack of bank activity and their immediate disappearance pointed to another decision. One made on the road in the mind of whoever was in charge once control over two lives had been established. The fire then became the final act. There is no romance in this theory, only the raw coldness of a mind that reduces people to obstacles. The farm, meanwhile, was finding its rhythm again. There were days when the wind blew from the north, carrying the scent of a freshly washed corral, a reminder of childhood. There were nights when a light rain tapped on the tin roof, as if in conversation with the shingles. The new dog learned to lie in the shade of the same post the old one had leaned against. In every corner, a practical lesson left by José or Almerinda proved its worth. The way to tie a rope so it wouldn't fray, the precise measure of salt to keep a calf from getting sick. The patience to study the pasture before making a promise. Their presence persisted in these gestures with the force of those who teach without ever giving a speech. At the end of that year, the family placed a simple, nameless cross near the clearing. It wasn't meant to be an altar, but a marker. Anyone who passed would know that something had happened there and that someone remembered. The wood groaned as it settled into the hard earth, and then it stood firm. The wind rustled the tops of the peaky trees, and a light scent of resin rose in the heat. No one cried. Not then. They cried later at home, listening to the creak of an old chair and the song of a cricket. Grief keeps its own hours and rarely performs for an audience. The possible answers, the frame that gives a mystery its shape without filling in the details, were all they had. The name of the person who had diverted the D20 would never be known. The exact dialogue would never be reconstructed. The motive would never be proven in a short sentence. What they could do, from that point on, was to organize their dignity, care for the land, honor their commitments, and teach the grandchildren the difference between courage and recklessness. History, after all, had already made it clear that violence does not require a grand stage. Sometimes it just walks in the door asking for a glass of water and leaves in slints, leaving the floor marked with an ash that the rain can never wash away. When the news of the identification spread, old letters emerged from long unopened drawers. One, dated 1991, bore the letterhead of a producers' association, inviting José to a meeting about the collective purchase of feed. It was a detail with no criminal weight, but it was a reminder of who he was. A man who preferred to bring people together. Another, from a distant relative, asked for help resolving a silly dispute over a fence. José's reply, saved in the same envelope, said that a fence is about conversation and mutual respect. The words of a man who believed in simple rules. Nothing in that paperwork pointed to the kind of conflict that ends with a weapon. The ranch hand, Tiao, his face now weathered by the sun and his hair thinning, offered to accompany the sons on visits to the old-timers. They entered homes that smelled of freshly brewed coffee, where chickens pecked at the floor beneath the table and oval-framed photographs told the stories of entire families. During one of these visits, a short elderly woman recalled that, Weeks before the disappearance, a well-dressed man not from around there had asked at the general store if the $5 million farmer was a trustworthy man. The phrase was more startling for the nickname than for the question. In a small town, labels grow like vines. That nickname, surely born from barroom exaggeration, had the power to turn a piece of information into a target. The sons decided then to follow the path of the money again. Not through bank records, but through conversation. They went back to the bank from that era, which now had a new face and a new manager. The archives held only a cold entry, a private appointment reserved for the morning of the 24th. At the notary's office, the oldest employee, her eyes still sharp and her memory vivid, said that Almerinda was the type to read everything in a low voice before signing. She remembered seeing her the week before, verifying a signature on a document. These fragments, devoid of spectacle, supported the narrative of an interrupted routine and dismantled the more fanciful theories. There had been no secret meeting, no trip far away, no voluntary disappearance. There had been an ordinary life, and a detour planned by someone else. The analysis of the remains, limited by the passage of time, still yielded one detail that touched everyone. Among the collected bones, they found the oval wedding band that on the day of its discovery had seemed like just a piece of twisted metal. Maurivis Antigo, a family friend, cleaned the ring with a patient technique. On the inside, he revealed two hand-scratched initials, almost illegible. They were the letters of José and Almerinda. The ring, which had lost its shine, regained a quiet dignity. It wasn't put on display, not turned into a trophy. It was placed in a wooden box, kept alongside Almerinda's accounting ledger, as if one object balanced the other. The union and the method side by side. To explore the mechanical possibilities, they called on an old-timer, the kind of man who could diagnose an engine just by listening to it. He explained that a D20 could certainly catch fire from a short in the wiring harness. But when that happens, the smell of burning plastic fills the air, and the driver almost always opens the door on reflex. The position of the bodies contradicted that scene. He also said that a fire started with fuel poured inside the cabin rises like a tongue, consuming everything in minutes without an explosion. The way the roof was burned and the lack of impact marks on the pillars pointed in that direction. It wasn't an official report that settled the matter. It was the sum of an experienced eye and the physical evidence, a line of reasoning that needed no technical jargon. Slowly, the town exchanged its obsession with theories for practical acts of remembrance. On the anniversary of the drone's discovery, a public school teacher took his students out to the fields and spoke of the cerrado, the savanna, as a guardian, of springs, of species, of stories. He showed them how the red earth stains the soles of their shoes and how the wind changes its tone just before the rain. He turned the bright midday sun into a lesson about care. Then he spoke of the couple without melodrama, teaching the children that real stories, no matter how harsh, deserve to be told without exaggeration. The boys returned home with mud on their shoelaces and a fresh idea about respect. The drone team, who had no obligation to return, showed up one day with an envelope of photos printed on matte paper. They gave the sons two sequences, the first from the moment the metallic rectangle appeared between the branches. The second from the farewell flyover, when the area was already marked off, showing only the yellow tape and the glint of rust. The images, viewed on a clean kitchen table, laid bare the power of chance allied with persistence. If the drone had flown just a few meters to the side, the shadow of the trees might have hidden the secret for another decade. The precision of the discovery served as a crooked comfort. At least the time of doubt was over. Tieo, who had blamed himself for his comment at the general store, grew quieter. One late afternoon, sitting on a fence post, he told one of the sons about a simple dream he had. to buy a small piece of land and raise a few dairy cows. The young man listened, smiled, and proposed a deal without any fanfare. He offered Tio the chance to lease a rectangle of pasture near his house for a symbolic fee. It wasn't a grand, dramatic act of charity. It was the family's way of saying, "We're still in this together." The arrangement worked. Tiao gained more responsibility and also the opportunity to give something back to the place that had become a source of his guilt. The following nights brought heavy rain, the kind that starts with a wind that slams doors and then pours down water as if the sky has cracked open. The noise on the tin roof was the music of childhood. The smell of wet earth filled the house like an invitation. The world in that moment seemed to propose a transition from the enigma to the life that needed tending. The sons, without forgiving by decree, began to speak of their parents in the present tense. Not just in a funeral tone. They told stories of their habits and recipes and laughed at their stubborn ways. The big story found its place within the small ones, which are the ones that truly nourish us. There were still those who would appear with a new rumor, spoken in a low voice at a car door. "I heard that," is a persistent phrase. The difference was that now it no longer cost them their sleep. The frame was firmly in place. All that was missing was the signature, and perhaps it would never come. What did come, every day, was the sun rising behind the hill, the rooster crowing at the wrong hour, the well water rising with effort, the smell of boiling milk escaping the pot. Life, as insistent as the grass, continued to sprout where, 11 years earlier, violence had tried to scorch everything dry. In early 2004, when green takes over the pastures and the river rises a hand's breadth as if it has taken a deep breath, the family decided to do something that couldn't be filed away in a notary's office. They arranged for an open-air mass near the old fig tree that shades the road. There was no intention of turning grief into an event. It was simply the need to gather neighbors, friends, and the people who had stopped to offer help in that difficult year. They spread cloths on wooden tables, set out thermoses of coffee, and cut slices of still warm cornbread cake. A timid accordion emerged from the chapel and played softly as if asking permission. The priest spoke of memory as a commitment and mentioned, without using names, the violence that aims to be final but never is. The wind played with the little girl's hair as she held her mother's hand. It was a simple afternoon, the kind that seems to say that the answers to the world's biggest questions are always found in a small gesture. After the mass, the drone technicians, now friends of the family, proposed a symbolic flyover. A wide circle over the farm, not to search but to see with new eyes. They sent the machine up, and the camera showed the house from above, the new corral, the long shadows of the trees falling like fingers, the threads of water running in parallel through the marsh. Seen from that height, the place looked like a drawing from a diligent schoolboy's notebook. The eldest son, who had always looked at the ground to solve problems, realized it was also good to look from a distance to understand proportion. The same technology that had once wounded them with a raw image now offered a comfort, a confirmation that the piece of the world their parents had built was still whole. On a trip to town, they ran into the knife salesman from the 90s, the one mentioned in an old testimony. He now ran a small cookware repair stand with a tin countertop and an unhurried smile. He told them that, shortly after the disappearance, he'd overheard a man at a truck stop say that setting a fire is better than a gunshot because it disappears faster. He didn't know if it was just bravado. He had no names. It was one of those phrases that circulates on the asphalt and sticks in an attentive ear. The account, while adding little in the way of proof, added density to the atmosphere of the era, a time when a dirt road was both a path and a hiding place. The rebalanced farm began to produce better. The right amount of rain made the grass grow lush, and the cows responded. The clinking of the milking machines in the early morning hours once again became the clock of the house. The kitchen filled with the smell of homemade bread coming out of the oven, and a guava jam, Almerinda's recipe, became a Saturday routine. Every now and then someone would take out the wedding band from its box, run a finger over the metal, and put it back. It wasn't worship of an object, it was a quiet affirmation. The conversation about the money, which had stalled at the cold wording of a legal process, moved forward. Part of it would be used to modernize the farm without betraying their parents' way of doing things. Another part would be invested in something with a human face. They chose to support the district school by renovating the sports court, buying books and filling the library with atlases, dictionaries, and literature that smelled of new pages. When the first books arrived, the sound of the plastic being torn off was like New Year's fireworks. The principal, a soft-spoken man, thanked them without a grand speech. He said that a child with a book in their hand learns to call things by their proper name. The phrase stuck with the family like a motto. From time to time, the clearing received a visit. There was no practical reason, but there was a need. To walk there, to feel the wind through your shirt, to step on the dry leaves that rustled like paper, was a way of maintaining a pact with the only truth they had. On one of these trips, the middle son noticed something trivial. The birdsong changed as you entered the circle of the clearing. Maybe it was the echo, maybe just an impression. He smiled at his own superstition and walked on. Nearing the marked tree trunk, he left a smooth stone he had found in the creek bed. The stone, in no way sacred, became a memento of his passage. Justice, in the end, concluded its formalities. The final document stated in dry language that the cause of death was officially recognized as undetermined. There were no names, no sentences, there was only a stamp and the chance to finally close the drawers. The document did not bring peace, but it did bring order. In many stories from the countryside, this is how it ends, with a piece of paper that describes what everyone already knows and what no one can fully prove. He sat down at the large table and read the text without haste. When he finished, he did not applaud, nor did he curse. He simply put it away. Life went on, imposing its own urgencies. A calf was born weak and needed milk from a makeshift bottle fashioned from a soda container. A fence gave way after a storm, and the task force assembled to repair it turned a Saturday into a Monday. The motor of the pump, the one that had been coughing for months, finally demanded its retirement, and a new one was installed with a small celebration of warm soda and easy laughter. In every repair, there was a memory of José, a piece of advice from Almerinda. Time, which once had only been a weight, began to blow in their favor, helping to dry the last of the tears and settle the dust on the road. One day, by the mango trees, the sons received a silent visitor. A middle-aged woman introduced herself as a distant relative of a man who, in the 90s, had run with a rough crowd on the roads. She came not to confess, nor to bring evidence, but to apologize for what their world might have done to the Rocha's world. It was a request without a direct object, a gesture that changes no sentence. They listened to her with respect, offered her cold water and a piece of cake. The woman wept quietly, dried her eyes with the back of her hand, and left down the road that led to the asphalt. The encounter, small and human, taught them that pain sometimes asks only for acknowledgement. In the balance of that decade of comings and goings, the family understood that not every enigma needs to be dispatched with a solution. Some simply ask for care and a name. The story of José and Almerinda, with its routine beginning, its violent turn, and its discovery of burned iron, fit into the Brazilian way of carrying on. Sweeping the yard at dawn, lighting the wood stove without hurry, talking in the shade, trusting in work as one trusts a boat. The drone, the reports, the roadside chatter, it all became pieces of a mosaic that explained without concluding. What was left to be written was reserved for the inside of the house, in the rooms where the afternoon light enters yellow. On the days when the rain sings on the tin roof and the most honest certainty is that a good memory does not ask for applause. It asks for presence. The following summer, when the heat seemed to double the daylight and clothes stuck to the body before noon, the sons decided to take inventory of everything the farm had carried since the 80s. There was a dark wooden shed where tools hung like memories. Hoes with worn handles, harnesses smelling of old leather, boxes of screws that Jose had sorted by size. They took everything out, piled it in the yard, and washed it down with a hose. The water bled red with dust until it formed a stream that trickled down to the marsh. Among the scraps, they found a battery-powered radio that could still pick up 2 stations, the same one that used to be on in the kitchen when Almerinda stirred a pot with her wooden spoon. The hissing sound of a plaintive country ballad brought a silence over them, as if the house itself were listening. Organizing the shed became a small rupture with the past. Neighbors came to offer a hand, and as it happens in the countryside, every offer of help brought a story. A tractor driver remembered that weeks before the disappearance, he had seen 2 men standing on the shoulder, measuring the road with a tape, claiming the city was planning maintenance. They had no logos on their vests, no official car. At the time, no one thought it strange. Today, that kind of detail makes you scratch your head. The sons took notes, compared them with old maps, and understood that that particular stretch of road would have allowed for an ambush without raising a cloud of curiosity, because everyone slowed down to pass it. The bridge, as they had already realized, was the world's brake pedal. The conversations led them to a roadside gas station that had survived a change of owner and a new coat of paint. The new attendant, the son of the old owner, had a ledger at home inherited from his father, where names and license plates appeared like the recorded heartbeats of the place. Leafing through it, they found an entry from 1992. The sale of 2 gallons of gasoline for service paid in cash by a customer with no account. The note was short, but it was accompanied by a scribbled comment. Strangers. It wasn't proof, not a clue that could lead to a conviction, but it aligned with the hypothesis of a quick fire started inside the car. The blue-covered notebook, smelling of old paper, became a corner piece in the mosaic. As the pieces found their place, the family had to decide the fate of the charred D20 pickup. Some of the recovered and catalogued remains were kept by the authorities. Another part, too twisted for any analysis, was returned to the family. It didn't fit in their hearts nor in their yard, but it fit into their commitment to close a cycle. They built a small, controlled bonfire in the yard with nothing but dry wood and careful attention. Before lighting it, they placed 2 objects on a table, a rear-view mirror, still stained, and a piece of the dashboard frame. There were no speeches, only silence, with water kept nearby. The small fire fulfilled its symbolic function, to return the burn to the air so it would not remain a prisoner on the veranda. When the last ember died, they doused it with water and swept the ashes away. The smell of smoke, for a moment, confused their memories, but it soon dispersed, surrendering to the afternoon wind. The routine of a cattleman, which waits for neither trial nor mass, pulled everyone back. Vaccinating the cattle, distributing salt in the troughs, mending a fence with new wire. Tiao, now more confident, led the herd at a steady pace, whistling softly. In the early morning, the dew would wet the cuffs of his pants and the mud would cling to his boots as if asking for company. Sometimes the eldest son would walk out alone through the back fields, go down to the riverbank and return with dirty feet, carrying a handful of angico seeds in his pocket. He said he would plant them along the path leading to the house, because a good tree provides shade and converses with time. The gesture became a habit, Every visitor received a seedling, and the farm began to collect new shadows. One afternoon, when heavy clouds gathered quickly and the wind turned the leaves of the mango trees inside out, a silver pickup truck stopped at the gate. A man got out, with the face of someone who had once been strong and now carried only weariness. He introduced himself as the owner of a junkyard in a neighboring town. He had heard about the case on television, recognized parts of the D20, and thought he should let them know. Back in the 90s, he had seen a similar burned-out shell arrive at his yard on an anonymous truck, and it left the same way, without any record, as if the job had been interrupted. He couldn't remember the date or the license plate. It was a fragmented testimony, but it aligned with the idea that someone had tried to erase the trail and, realizing the difficulty of moving an entire body of rust, had preferred to let time do the work. The man drank some water, wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm, and left before the rain began to fall. The storm broke, thick and heavy, and the sound on the tin roof filled the house with a familiar music. In the rhythm of the downpour, the fear that had haunted the farm gate began to shrink. There was still caution, locking the house, coordinating schedules, avoiding bad roads at night, but life was no longer a hostage to the case. The renovated school held its first environmental education classes with a guided tour of the local savanna. The teacher taught the children that the red earth was not just a color, but a history of fire and rebirth. The children returned from the trail with mud on their shoelaces and dirt-toothed grins. The family watched from a distance, understanding that they too were part of this cycle of regrowth. In May, the cattle buyer showed up with a gift that was worth more in gesture than in price. A modern agricultural scale that would make their work easier and reduce loss. He brought it on his truck, helped install it, and didn't stay for a photo. Their thanks was conveyed in a firm handshake and a cup of strong, filtered coffee. The scale began to creak at dawn like an object learning a new language. The sound mingled with the cry of the seriemas and the hum of the new water pump, which drew water from the well with a pleasing constancy. At night, the family resumed an interrupted tradition, sitting on the veranda without hurry to watch the darkness arrive. The sky, unpolluted by city lights, returned the stars as if it had been saving them for a special occasion. They talked about the day. They laughed about a runaway calf. They planned for tomorrow like someone mending old cloth. When the conversation veered toward the clearing, someone would remember a phrase Almerinda used to say when something couldn't be fixed. "Then we must be impeccable in our care." The sentence became a kind of house policy. There were still questions without answers, but now there were also answers without questions. The kind life gives you when you insist on continuing. At the start of the dry season, when the afternoon light becomes a blade and the termite mounds look like miniature chimneys, the family decided to organize a charity auction in the shed. They would sell a few calves and donate part of the proceeds to a small scholarship fund for students in the district who wanted to study agricultural technology. The idea was born in a hammock on the porch, and it took hold because it had a human face. The event brought together people in clean clothes smelling of laundry soap, their hats set just right, their laughter restrained. A well-known auctioneer lent his voice, and when the first lot came up, the gavel struck hard, echoing in the wooden rafters. Between bids, plates of pastries and cups of sugarcane juice circulated. It was a discreet celebration, and yet the absence of José and Almerinda cast a beautiful shadow, the kind that protects, not the kind that darkens. During a break, a man with clear eyes approached the middle son and, asking permission, told an old story. He said that in 1992 he used to transport timber on the dirt roads and was once stopped by two men who offered him a cheap escort. He refused and received a reply that sounded like both advice and a threat. "The road has ears." He only understood the weight of the phrase years later. The account fit with the idea of silent control that the family had already come to accept as the frame for their story. This wasn't about showy gunmen. It was the rule of conversation that pressures and directs. That night, back at the house, they discussed it without resentment. The world off the asphalt had always had its own codes, and the couple had been caught by them on a morning when all they wanted to do was sign a piece of paper. Although the story sought no heroes, Tiao inadvertently earned a chapter of his own. His lease on the small pasture prospered. He built a small corral, fenced it with wood left over from the shed, and named the area Remanso, a simple name meaning calm waters that said a great deal. At the end of the day, he would milk 2 cows, sell the milk to neighbors, and keep a little to make fresh cheese, which he wrapped in a clean cloth. The dignity of his work washed away the last crumbs of guilt that had insisted on living in his eyes. One afternoon, he brought a still warm cheese to the family and said shyly that it was something the Patroa would have liked to put on her bread. The silence that followed was a good one, the kind that understands that kindness is also a form of justice. The sporadic trips to the clearing transformed into a habit marked by dates. At the end of June, for example, they would walk there early in the morning before the sun enriched the earth. They would bring a small bottle of water, a hat, and a cloth to spread on the ground. They would sit near the marked tree trunk and talk, as if speaking to a park bench. They didn't ask for a sign or expect a reply. They just shared the news. The calf that was born with spots, the school renovation, the stubborn flaw in the wood stove. Sometimes the wind would climb the hill, bringing the smell of green picky fruit. Sometimes it would come dry, rustling in the leaves. These visits began to give the memory of their parents a less jagged edge. The pain stopped prodding with every step and began to walk alongside them, hand in hand. From a practical standpoint, almost everything was resolved. The legal process had closed. The farm was productive again. The scholarship fund had begun to help 2 young men who rode their bicycles to the technical school. The only thing left to decide was what to do with the big house, empty of voices, too quiet at night. They considered selling it and building a smaller one, but a single late afternoon rainstorm changed their minds. The sound on the tin roof worked like a memory that refused to be filed away. The decision was made. The house would remain open with its creaking wooden doors, its smells of coffee and cookie tins, its wall clock that sometimes told the wrong time, not out of attachment but in recognition of that space as a shelter for stories. The community, sensitive to the gesture, began to gather there for collective work days. They would run a new electrical wire, repair a neighbor's fence, plant seedlings along the roadside. Anyone who arrived caked in mud was received with a towel on their shoulder and a glass of cold juice. On one of those afternoons, a truck driver who rarely stopped took off his hat and said that the Rocha house reminded him of an old inn, a place where a traveler recovers his breath and his hope. No one wrote the sentence down. It echoed for days like the distant whistle of a steam train that doesn't even pass through there anymore. Still, every now and then a new theory would appear, dressed as a revelation. One spoke of a neighbor's jealousy, another accused a distant relative. The conversations, once flammable, now lasted only a few minutes. The family learned to respond with what they knew and return the rest to silence. Not out of resignation, but for the hygiene of the soul. The enigma of their parents would not be solved at a bar counter, but neither would it be forgotten. It would be kept in its proper place, between what can be told and what must be respected. On the second to last Sunday of July, they held a large luncheon. Rice with piqui, country-style chicken, and a salad of greens picked that morning. Children came, the elderly came, and so did the drone technicians. now table companions and friends who shared bad jokes. After coffee, they all walked up to the fig tree by the road. There they planted a simple wooden plaque, its letters burned into the wood with a hot iron. José Humberto and Almerinda, the earth holds, we remember. There were no dates of birth or death, just a phrase that holds true for all time. As they drove the stake into the ground, the hard earth resisted, but then it yielded. The sound of the hammer striking echoed down the dirt road, a signal of a beginning, not an end. The farewell they had been missing had nothing to do with a coffin, flowers, or speeches. It was about acknowledging that the road that had taken José and Almerinda on that morning in 1992 was still the same. Straight in some stretches, treacherous in others, demanding attention and humility. On the anniversary of the drone's discovery, the family woke early and prepared for a small pilgrimage. They left the house, crossed the creek, passed over the bridge that now creaked less, and turned onto the dirt path leading to the marker. They carried a cloth, homemade bread, Tiao's cheese, and a flask of coffee. The wind blew from the side, kicking up dust that shimmered in the sun like mirrored salt. At that hour, the cerrado smelled of warm leaves and unspoken promises. They sat on the earthen ground, leaning against the marked trunk. The eldest son spoke of the scholarships that were now allowing two young people to learn how to care for the land with science and respect. The middle son told of the new scales now working, of the gains in management, of how the pasture was responding better. The daughter, who ran the local school, described the new shelves filled with books and the joy of seeing a child in flip-flops leafing through an atlas. Tiao arrived later, hat in hand, and sat beside them, silent as a shovel that knows when to stop digging. There they avoided questions that pierce and made statements that mend. José and Almerinda continue to guide their steps not by the shock of the mystery but by the steadfastness of their lifelong choices. The conversation drifted to the small memories that together paint the portrait of a person. José had a habit of saving bent nails to use later. Almerinda numbered the jars in the cupboard to know which needed refilling. He liked to drive slowly on the dirt road so as not to wear out the car. She would mentally calculate the week's expenses as if solving a puzzle. No one there romanticized the hardship. They also remembered the stubbornness, him grumbling about a fence that seemed to bend on its own, her complaining about the sugar disappearing too quickly. A fond memory has the freedom to laugh at its subjects. As the sun began to set, they decided it was time to leave. Each one picked up a smooth little stone from the ground and placed it at the foot of the simple cross. It wasn't an invented ritual, it was just a way of saying, "We came and now we leave." On the way back, the road answered with the sound of tires crunching on gravel. The wind brought dust into the car and in the kitchen. The kettle sang before the door had even fully cleaned it. At night, the rain announced its arrival with a cool breath and then broke upon the tin roof, beating a steady rhythm, like a good memory. The house breathed peacefully, the yellow lights giving the walls the look of an embrace. The narrative of the case, which once made headlines, now fit onto 3 shelves. What is known, what is supposed, and what is accepted. It is known that they left for the bank, that they never arrived, that they were taken to a clearing, and that the car was burned from the inside out. It is supposed that they were intercepted at the bridge, that a conversation rerouted their journey, that control was taken without alarm, and that the fire was a cover-up. It is accepted that the names of the perpetrators and the precise motive may never surface, because old roads swallow tracks, and the codes of that era preferred slants. Between these shelves, the family chose to live, to plant, to renovate, to study, to tell stories without too much sugar. In the final paragraph they keep for themselves, the children gave thanks to chance, and to the persistence of that drone that cut through the sky in 2003 and pointed to a hidden wound. Without that aerial image, they might have remained trapped in a waiting that had no body. With the image, they could give a name to their pain and build an after. It's strange to admit, but there, technology and the countryside joined hands. The camera found what the eye on foot could not reach, and the ground taught them the rest, with the patience of one who knows that everything has its time to be born, to grow, and to become a memory. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe to the channel to receive other true cases, told with respect and calm. Share this video with those who value memory and truth. These stories help keep alive the conversation about the Brazil we walk upon. In the small hours of the morning, when everyone was asleep, the wind made the kitchen door creak and stirred the thin curtain. The dog lifted its head, checked on the house, and lay down again. The wall clock showed the wrong time, which no one ever fixed because it had become part of the place. Outside, the Angico seedlings planted months ago faced the chill with their slender branches. The farm went on as it always had, even when the world seemed to have stopped. And without any need for an announcement, it was understood that José and Almerinda would continue to live there. In the sound of the rain on the tin roof, in the smell of wet earth rising from the ground, in the mud that dirties your feet and reminds you with every step that a good truth does not shout, it endures.